So tonight I have some short verses to read for you for our scripture. So they're actually all three just a single verse. So the first one is Romans 3:23. It's one that I'm sure y'all are fairly familiar with. And it simply says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." And the second one is John 10:10. It says, "The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly." And the third is John 13:34. It says, "So now I am giving you a new commandment. Love each other. Just as I have loved you, you should love each other." She is very excited tonight. Yep. So tonight, I've realized that I just really like telling stories about seminary. So tonight, I think we end up with like 2 or 3 stories from seminary. So for starters, in my seminary, for the record, it's called Iliff School of Theology. I usually just refer to it as Iliff. We had some really, really amazing professors, like really top-notch, well-published, like leaders in their fields. Truly amazing professors, which also meant that I had some really, really difficult classes. The most notorious professor was Mark George. He was the Hebrew Bible professor, which we would call that Old Testament. And so we had some really, really hard classes in there where like we had entire lists, like 4 or 5 page lists of just line by line by line of people and places. And yeah, you basically had to know every single detail about every single term on that list or every person, where they were in the Bible, what they did. So they were intense, difficult classes. But one of my favorite moments in Hebrew Bible was when we were doing biblical exegesis. So that's your word for the night, exegesis. It's kind of a fun word. It simply means that in doing like a Bible study, to exegete is simply to read what's in the text. You probably have a chapter or 2 or even 3 that you're reading, and you're basically interpreting only based on what you're reading. So like you're not trying to draw in extra biblical interpretations, because you're trying to just read what's there to actually get a grasp for what it's saying. Not like reading in, like we read in a lot of New Testament concepts into the Old Testament, and that can really get in the way of interpretations. So we did a lot of biblical exegesis in my Old Testament classes. And so Mark George was particularly strict sometimes with this. Like when we were doing these interpretations, he would ask sometimes, like, "Where did you get that from?" Because if we couldn't really point it out, then we'd kind of just throw the interpretation out the window again. Like that's kind of just the very scholarly way to do it. So I had a classmate who was one of those classmates that, you know, like I liked her just fine. I just would have preferred not to have too many classes with her. You know, we all kind of have those people. Like we like them, but if we don't have to be around them that much, that's okay too. So this was one of those ladies, and it was partly just because, especially in situations like this, she just didn't really follow the directions quite as well. Like she really liked to draw in her own interpretations from completely elsewhere, or just offer up kind of silly things. So one of these times she was doing some exegesis, and she offered up one of those like really wild interpretations. And of course Mark George is pretty open-minded, so he's like, "Oh, where are you getting this from? Like, can you explain it?" And she just says, "God is God." Like that's her interpretation, and that's somehow explains it. And she also had this wonderful Southern accent, so it was especially funny to hear her say that. But so this gets to kind of this odd concept where even if we don't really have an explanation for things, like when we're interpreting things, we do have something that we always go back to. And for her, it was this idea that God is just like so big and so unexplainable that like if you can't explain it, well, that's the explanation. Like she'd definitely been taught that sort of thing, and I'm sure we've all heard that sort of thing, like God is just too big for us to understand, something along those lines. And so I came to understand that a little bit better with a different professor, Miguel de la Torre, who was also fantastic. But he taught me this concept of that basically everyone has something, some sort of embedded theology or The more scholarly, studied people would have like a verse that they could point to, but we all have something that we jump to explain basically everything else. He kind of described it as it's also where we enter into the Bible. Like most of us who have really studied the Bible can kind of point to a verse or like a set of verses, a story, something like that, and that's really where we start. And so the verses that I read tonight are 3 examples of such things. The second one was the one that actually Miguel de la Torre said was his, which is simply that, basically that concept that Jesus came to give life and give it abundantly. So therefore, like that's basically how he reads everything. Everything in the Bible is meant to give life and give it abundantly. And if it doesn't do that, then it doesn't support what this overarching theme is. So it's not quite as worthwhile. Because of course it also becomes important when we really read the Bible, because if you're really studied in the Bible, you'll find that a lot of these concepts that you find also have a contradicting one somewhere. Like, I'll be completely honest, there are a lot of contradicting things in the Bible, and so it can be really important to have this basis of what you believe to be ultimately true, so that you kind of have a way to judge which one's a more worthy one to think about. And so this also starts to come out when you get into real life. Like, it's not just this big scholarly idea. Like, it definitely has huge implications when you're actually studying the Bible, but it also just comes out in daily life. And so that's why I also offer up the first one, which is this Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. I feel like that one is actually about the most common embedded theology, embedded idea that people interpret all of life through. I would say if they're conservative Christians especially, I've heard this from a lot of my conservative Christian friends, I've heard that parroted back to me, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. It's always that exact phrase even. And so it's this idea that somehow the world is flawed, like humanity has made these mistakes and that has separated us from God. Somehow we are imperfect. And so therefore, like basically everything that happens, like everything bad that happens in your life is because people are imperfect. I mean, in a sense, this makes some sense when you flip on the news and see all of the crime and all of the war going on. Like obviously that is happening in a very broken world, or at least these are very broken people causing these things to happen. And so in a manner, this makes a lot of sense. And for a lot of people, this is basically the essence of Christianity. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. This idea of sin is completely central to their ideas of Christianity. And so that's also where they enter into the Bible. That's where this concept comes, because everything that they interpret, they're going to read as, well, humanity is flawed and broken, and that's why this is happening in the Bible. Or like, just any sort of interpretation is going to be central in this topic. And so I also offer up the third set of verse, or the third verse, I guess it's a single verse, which is, in my opinion, the more worthy of the 3, obviously, because that's what I've chosen. But it just is Jesus telling us to love each other. He says it twice in this verse. If you read this next verse, it's 3 times. So it's just Jesus trying to hound into us, just love each other, love each other, love each other. I talked about this last week. And so, of course, I mean, obviously, you've heard me talk about this a few times now, I think. But that's just because this really is the essence of Christianity in my mind. And so this is where I enter into the Bible and where I interpret everything else from. And so there are huge differences, I think, between this idea of sin as the essence of Christianity and where people start interpreting things, especially their daily life, as opposed to this idea of loving each other. In my mind, I mean, we all kind of come into Christianity with these ideas of sin and also redemption. But I feel like the difference here is that the idea of sin is the problem, but this idea of love and redemption is the solution. And so it's the difference between focusing entirely on the problem or if you're actually going to focus on the solution. And so this can be a pretty big deal when you're constantly thinking about sin and thinking about the brokenness of the world and how people are flawed and how God is perhaps disappointed with that failure, with those sins, with those things that people do wrong. And so if you keep focusing on that and don't even really consider any other option, any alternative, really it's just living this out because that's what you've been told. If you never outright consider what you're doing, then this can definitely go too far. I mean, it can go too far no matter what you're starting with. But especially this idea of sin, I think, can be really dangerous if you're entirely focused on that. I mean, the most obvious example in my mind is the infamous Westboro Baptist Church, which are known for picketing military funerals just because they disagree with that in some way, or just these really hateful actions against groups that you really don't even necessarily expect. They're especially hateful towards anyone who identifies as LGBTQ, etc. That's basically the queer community. That's the other word that we sometimes group that under. Lesbian, gay, trans, etc. Anyways, and so their ideas here are that since these people have apparently sinned, that's what they've decided, that they deserve to die. And so they often say that God hates them. I mean, I don't care what you believe, whether you believe such ideas of sin are correct or wrong, but God does not hate anyone. And so this is an example of definitely where people have gone too far when they're just immersed in this idea of sin and humanity as a failure. It's too much focusing on the problem and not enough on the solution. And so I would encourage you simply to start with the question of, where do you start? Where does your idea of Christianity begin? And are you interpreting through this lens of sin or of love or something else? Because again, even if you entirely focus on, perhaps even if I focus too much on love, when I'm interpreting things, I will also take it too far, because then I will miss the brokenness. And certainly the brokenness can be valuable too. So we all really need to begin with figuring out where we start, where we enter into the Bible. What is that concept that draws us in, and that idea which we interpret everything else through? And again, I would suggest that the most worthy thing, in my mind at least, is to focus on this, what I would call the solution, the loving one another, the redemption. For God so loved the world. That was the reason behind Jesus. You know, the reason wasn't simply that the world sinned, and so therefore God gave Jesus to the world to save it. But God loved the world. That's why he did it. And over you see Jesus preaching to love. Jesus even says that's why he came, was to teach us how to love one another. And so I would simply ask once more, where do you enter into the Bible? And are you focusing on a problem, or are you focusing on the solution? Or do you not know where to focus yet? Do you need to explore that more? But whatever you do, I would really recommend figuring it out, because, like I said, if it's left unexamined, it can certainly end up going too far and lead you astray. And of course, I would always recommend continue to love one another, continue to love God, because that's ultimately what Jesus wants us to do. So may it be so. Amen.